I was 5 years old when I learned how long a child could keep believing her parents were coming back. I remember my mother crouching in front of me beside a fallen tree. "Stay right here, Audrey." Her hands were on my shoulders. I can still remember the hard edge of one of her rings pressing through my sweater. "Don't wander off. We'll be back." I nodded because I was 5. And because when your mother tells you to wait, you wait. My father was already behind the wheel. I heard the passenger door close. Then the engine started. At first, I wasn't afraid. That part matters. I sat on the tree trunk with my knees together and picked little brown needles from my socks. Pine sap stuck to 2 of my fingers. Every few minutes, I looked toward the narrow dirt road between the trees. I expected our car to come back around the bend. I imagined Mom opening the door and saying I had done a good job waiting. So I tried very hard to be good. A distant engine made me jump up once. It wasn't them. Then another. Not them either. The light between the trees began turning orange, then gray. I remember rubbing my arms because the air had gotten colder. I remember being hungry. I remember needing to use the bathroom and being afraid to move because Mom had said to stay right there. What if they came back and I wasn't where they had left me? What if they thought I hadn't listened? What if they drove away again? So I stayed. Every crack of a branch became footsteps. Every gust through the trees became my mother calling my name. Every pair of headlights I imagined beyond the road became my father's car. At some point, I started crying, quietly. Even then, I was afraid crying too loudly might somehow make things worse. I had no words for abandonment. I had no understanding of custody, foster care, adoption, money, pride, or adults who could make a terrible decision and then spend years changing the story of why they had made it. I understood one thing. My parents had told me to wait, and I believed that if I waited well enough, they would come back. They didn't. Someone else found me. Someone else took me somewhere warm. And for the next 20 years, no matter how much of a life I built, some part of me remained that little girl beside the fallen tree, wondering what she had done wrong. Then, when I was 25, the woman who had actually raised me died. Her name was Ruth Hale, and she left me everything. 8 weeks after I learned what Ruth's estate was worth, my biological father slammed his hand down on a restaurant table hard enough to make 5 water glasses jump. "That money belongs to us." Bethany, the younger daughter my parents had raised, went completely still beside him. My Aunt Caroline stared at the table. My mother, Denise, watched me with the tight, controlled expression she used whenever she wanted everyone else in the room to calm down before she had actually calmed down herself. I looked at my father, Tom Mercer. 20 years earlier, I had watched the back of his car disappear between the trees. Now he was leaning across a polished table, demanding the estate of the woman who had fed me, raised me, sat through my fevers, taught me to drive, and stayed beside me through every nightmare that ended with headlights that never returned. I opened the folder in front of me. Dad gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think paperwork changes what happened?" I pulled out one page. "No." I slid it toward him. "But I'd like you to answer one question." His eyes dropped to the bottom. I watched the color leave his face. "Is that your signature?" Mom reached for the paper. "That isn't what you think it is." I looked at her. "I haven't told you what I think it is. Because that document was not the reason I had started looking. It was where 6 weeks of looking had taken me. And what I found was worse than the memory I had carried since I was 5. My parents had not simply left me in the woods once. They had been given chances afterward. Chances to know where I was. Chances to see me. Chances to bring me home. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 8 weeks earlier, I still wanted to believe none of that was true. Ruth had been dead for 3 months when her estate attorney placed the final inventory in front of me. I hated that the document reduced her life to categories: real property, brokerage assets, retirement accounts, cash reserves, personal property. The total, after the estate's obligations and expected expenses, was a little over $3.4 million. Ruth had never lived like a millionaire. She had bought her small house decades earlier and paid it off. She had inherited a modest investment account from her parents when she was younger, added to it regularly, reinvested everything, and apparently possessed the kind of patience that allowed ordinary-looking numbers to become extraordinary ones over 40 years. Her retirement accounts made up another large portion. She drove a 12-year-old Subaru when she died. She clipped grocery coupons. She once spent 20 minutes arguing with me because I had thrown away a glass jar she thought was perfectly good for leftovers. There was nothing magical about the money. It was simply Ruth. 40 years of Ruth. The attorney turned one page toward me. This is the portion scheduled for distribution once the remaining administrative matters are complete. I stared at the number without really seeing it. Ruth had spent 40 years building that security. I had spent the last 3 months wishing I could trade every dollar of it for one more Tuesday dinner with her. The attorney must have read something in my face because his voice softened. You don't have to make any major decisions immediately. I wasn't planning to. That's usually wise. He hesitated, then added, and if anyone contacts you about the estate, especially anyone asking you to sign documents, have them go through the proper process. You're under no obligation to make private agreements because someone claims they have a right to the assets. I looked up. Why would anyone claim that? I'm not saying they will. I'm saying grief and money sometimes bring people forward. At the time, I thought he meant distant cousins. I didn't know he meant my parents. When I got home, there was one last archive box from Ruth's desk, waiting on my dining table. I had been avoiding it. Ruth understood documents the way some people understood recipes. She labeled things, dated things, kept originals in sleeves and copies in separate folders. She was the reason I had ended up in digital preservation. I opened the box. There was my adoption decree. School records. A bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that was much too sentimental for Ruth, and therefore made my throat hurt immediately. Underneath those sat a narrow folder with the case number from my childhood written across the front. Inside was a note in Ruth's handwriting. When you're ready, ask for the whole record. Don't let anybody, including me, tell you what it means before you read it yourself. I ran my thumb across the ink. That was Ruth. Even dead, she refused to make herself the authority on my life. I closed the folder. I wasn't ready. Or at least that was what I told myself. 2 mornings later, I was at work positioning a 19th century ledger beneath an overhead cradle scanner when Maya leaned over the edge of my workstation. You've been glaring at that book for 10 minutes. I'm not glaring. You're absolutely glaring. The accession note says 1,894. So, I adjusted the support beneath the binding. The paper stock and binding notes suggest later. And somebody penciled copy inside the rear cover. Maya peered at it as if the ledger had personally offended her. So, which date is real? I don't start with real. I captured the next image, checked the focus, then entered the identifier into the collection record. I start with where it came from. I compared the creation note with the accession record, flagged the discrepancy, and marked the digital object as a copy pending verification. Once the files moved to storage, I ran a checksum to confirm nothing had changed in transfer. Maya watched me for a moment. You know, normal people just scan things. Normal people create archival disasters. She laughed and went back to her desk. My phone vibrated beside the keyboard. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the subject line. From your mother. My hand stopped. Not Ruth. No one had called Ruth anything except Mom in my life for almost 2 decades. The sender was Denise Mercer, my biological mother. I read the subject 3 times before opening it. Audrey, I heard about Ruth. I am so sorry you lost her. Whatever happened between us, I would never wish that kind of pain on you. There are things you deserve to know. Your father and I have spent 20 years wondering where you were. Whether you were safe. Whether you remembered us. We searched for years. We were kept away from you. Please let us explain. Mom. I stared at that final word. Mom. My body reacted before my thoughts did. My throat tightened. 5 years old. Pine needles against my socks. Stay right here. We'll be back. I locked my phone and set it face down. Then I picked it up again less than 30 seconds later. That afternoon, I agreed to a call. Denise's face appeared first. She looked older than the handful of pictures I had seen online, of course, but I recognized her eyes immediately. That unsettled me more than I expected. Tom joined a few seconds later. For one strange moment, none of us spoke. Then Denise smiled. I heard about Ruth, she said. I'm sorry you lost her. Thank you. We never wanted things to happen this way. I waited. She continued. We never stopped wondering about you. My fingers tightened around my coffee mug. Tom leaned toward his camera. We searched for years, Audrey. There it was again. The sentence I had spent 20 years wanting. I should have felt relief. Instead, something in me tightened. What happened? Denise exhaled. It's complicated. Okay. The system got involved. Ruth had resources. We didn't. Once people made decisions, we were shut out. Tom's voice hardened. There are legal things you don't understand. Ruth got you through a system that was supposed to be temporary. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means an adoption can come out of circumstances that weren't clean. Denise glanced toward him. Tom. What? She deserves to know. He looked back at me. That estate exists because Ruth built a life around a relationship that never should have happened the way it did. The words were slippery enough to sound important. I felt fear before I could stop it. Are you saying you're challenging the adoption? I'm saying there were problems. Have you filed anything? Neither answered immediately. That pause did more for me than any threat. I asked again. Have you filed anything? Tom's mouth tightened. We're trying to keep this in the family. I looked at the screen. I haven't been in your family for 20 years. Denise flinched. Or maybe I only wanted to believe she did. We want to change that. Then why were we talking about Ruth's money? I didn't ask. Not yet. Bethany contacted me the next morning. She was 21. My younger sister. My parents had raised her. Her message began. Please don't punish them for what happened when you were 5. I read it twice. Then came 3 photographs. One showed Denise at a fundraiser for missing children. Another showed Tom, Denise, and Bethany standing beneath Christmas lights, Bethany between them. The third showed candles arranged along a church wall. Bethany called before I decided what to say. I know this is weird, she said immediately. I know you don't know me. No, I don't. But I know them. I said nothing. Her voice softened. I grew up watching them search for you. Something about the sentence bothered me. Not emotionally. Logically. You're 21? Yes. I had disappeared 20 years earlier. Bethany would have been around one. A story told often enough can feel like a memory, especially when everyone you love tells it the same way. I didn't correct her. Instead, I asked, what do you remember? She hesitated. Mom crying. The candle nights. Posters. At 1? I didn't mean literally when I was 1. I mean growing up. There was defensiveness in her voice now. I backed off. I understand. A few seconds passed. Then she asked the question I suspected had been waiting behind the rest. Do you really need all that money? I closed my eyes. There it was. Not reunion. Not yet. Money. I don't think that's any of your business. They're scared. Of what? That you're going to use it to erase them completely. I almost laughed, but nothing about it felt funny. They managed to live 20 years without me. That's not fair. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe nothing about this was. But by the time we hung up, one thing had become painfully clear. Bethany might have been trapped inside the story my parents had told her. She was also someone who stood to benefit if I believed it. 3 days later, Denise and Tom asked to meet me in person. I chose a coffee shop. Public. Neutral. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat with my back to the wall. Tom brought a folder. That told me more than the smiles did. Denise started with childhood pictures. Tom got to the point. We want the estate placed into a family trust. I stared at him. A trust for whom? For the family. What family? His jaw moved. Denise touched his wrist. Audrey, nobody is trying to take anything from you. You just asked me to transfer an estate worth $3.4 million. We're asking you to put it somewhere it can be divided fairly. Fairly for whom? Your family. I looked at Denise. The woman who left me that estate was my family. Her face tightened. Tom pushed the folder toward me. If you cooperate, there's no reason anyone needs to challenge what Ruth did. There it was. The threat dressed as compromise. I did not touch the folder. How much do you think belongs to you? Tom's answer came immediately. All of it came from a life that should have been ours. For a few seconds, I became 5 again. I wanted to explain myself. I wanted to tell them I had not asked Ruth for money, that I had worked, that I had my own salary, that I would have given every dollar back to have her alive. I wanted to prove I wasn't greedy. Good girls listened. Good girls waited. Good girls explained until everyone understood. My hand moved toward the folder, then stopped. No. Tom blinked. What? I'm not transferring anything. Audrey, if you think you have a legal claim, use the legal process. Denise's face went pale. We don't want to sue our own daughter. If you want a relationship with me, then don't make money the price of admission. Tom leaned back. You don't know the whole story. For once, I didn't argue. I thought about Ruth's note. Ask for the whole record. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe I didn't know. But neither of them was going to be the only source anymore. That night, I took the case number from Ruth's box and photographed it. I found the records request procedure for adults seeking access to their own childhood case material. I read the eligibility rules twice. Then the privacy limitations. Then the section explaining that some material could be redacted. I filled out the request myself. No lawyer did it for me. No one told me what to ask for. Before I pressed submit, my finger hovered over the button. There was still a way back. I could close the page. I could tell myself Ruth had loved me, and that was enough. I could tell myself Denise and Tom had been young, frightened, poor, confused, whatever explanation hurt least. If I requested the record, I might learn things about Ruth I didn't want to know. I might learn things about my parents I could never forgive. I pressed submit. The confirmation arrived less than a minute later. Estimated processing time, 4 to 6 weeks. I sat alone at my dining table while the screen dimmed. Then I looked at Ruth's archive box. Something made me pull it toward me again. I removed the adoption decree. The letters. The folder with the case number. Underneath them was a cream-colored envelope I hadn't noticed before. Ruth's handwriting ran across the front. 4 words. First notice they received. My fingers went cold. For 20 years, my parents had told everyone they didn't know where I was. For 3 days, they had told me the same thing. I turned the envelope over. The flap was still sealed, and for the first time since I was 5 years old, I was afraid of what might happen when I stopped waiting for my parents' version of the story and opened my own. The paper inside Ruth's envelope was thinner than I expected. For 20 years, the moment my parents learned I had survived had existed in my imagination as something enormous. A police officer at their door, my mother collapsing into a chair, my father grabbing his keys before the officer finished speaking. Instead, it was a photocopy of an agency notice, typed lines, a case number, my full childhood name, a sentence confirming that I had been located alive and placed temporarily in emergency care. Nothing about it looked dramatic enough to carry the weight I had given it. Then my eyes reached the acknowledgement page clipped behind it. Received by Thomas Mercer. Below that was my father's signature. The date stopped me. 11 days after I had been found. My thumb stayed against the edge of the paper. During our video call, Dad had said Ruth entered my life through a system that had shut them out. Mom had told me they had spent years not knowing where I was. Bethany had grown up hearing that they searched for me. Yet, 11 days after someone found me in those woods, my father had signed a document confirming that the agency responsible for me had contacted him. The room seemed suddenly too small. A 5-year-old version of me tried to rise inside my head, demanding a conclusion before I had one. They knew. They lied. They didn't want me. I pushed my chair away from the table. No. The word came out aloud. Ruth had taught me better than that. A document could prove what it said. It could not automatically prove everything I wanted it to mean. The notice proved they had been notified. It did not tell me what happened next. Maybe Dad had signed it and then spent months fighting to find out where I was. Maybe the agency had imposed requirements they could not satisfy. Maybe Ruth had known more than she had ever told me. Hope was already trying to turn those possibilities into facts. That frightened me, almost as much as the signature. I brought my laptop to the dining table and opened a blank spreadsheet. At the top, I made 3 headings. Known. Claimed. Not yet verified. Under known, I typed. My parents were notified that I had been found within 11 days. Under claimed, they searched for years without knowing where I was. Under the last heading, What information were they given after the notice? Were they offered contact? Did they attempt reunification? How did temporary placement become adoption? For several minutes, the cursor blinked below the final question. Then, another sentence came back to me. Dad at the coffee shop. You don't know the whole story. He was right. The mistake would have been letting him decide when I knew enough of it. The next evening, the dining room became a version of my workbench. Not literally. Nothing from my job came home with me, and none of Ruth's papers went anywhere near the university's systems. The files belonged to me, not to my employer. An inexpensive scanner sat beside my laptop. I placed the first notice on the glass, created a preservation copy, then a separate reading copy so I could enlarge the faded type without altering the original file. The paper itself went into an archival sleeve. The original envelope went into another. Each file received a date, source description, and identifier. Then, mostly because habit made me incapable of doing otherwise, I generated a checksum for the preservation copies. Ruth used to tease me for keeping receipts from purchases that had warranties shorter than the life of the receipt paper. Dad had laughed during our first call when I told him what I did for a living. So you scan old papers? That was how people described preservation, when they thought the object mattered more than its history. Scanning was the easy part. The harder question was always the same. Where did this come from? What existed before it? What came after? Who created it? And what could it actually establish? By midnight, the first notice had become one row on a much larger chronology. There was still more white space than evidence. That was important. White space had a way of tempting people to fill it with whatever story hurt least. Mom tried to fill it for me the following morning. Her text arrived while I was standing in line for coffee. I found something I thought you might want. 3 photographs followed. The first showed me as a baby in a yellow sleeper. The second showed Dad holding me in what looked like a backyard. In the third, Mom sat on a couch with me asleep against her chest. A message appeared beneath them. I kept everything. My chest tightened before I could stop it. There was something almost obscene about seeing proof that I had once fitted naturally into her arms. For years, my memories of Denise Mercer had begun with the woods. The photographs insisted there had been a before. Her phone rang less than a minute later. I nearly let it go. Instead, I stepped out of line and answered. Hi. Did you see them? Mom asked. Yes. You had that yellow outfit until you grew out of it. You hated socks. A laugh almost entered her voice. For a few moments, she sounded like someone describing a daughter, rather than defending herself to one. That was what made my next question difficult. When did you find out I'd been found? The warmth disappeared so subtly that I could have pretended not to notice. What? After the woods. When did you learn I was safe? A pause. Not for a long time. My grip tightened around the phone. How long? Audrey, it was 20 years ago. I know. Everything was chaos. How long, Mom? She exhaled. I don't remember exact dates. That was possible. I rarely remembered the exact date of an ordinary event from 5 years earlier, much less 20. So I narrowed the question. Was it weeks? Months? Years? Her tone sharpened. Why are you interrogating me? People at the coffee shop moved around me, cups knocking softly against the counter. I asked when you found out your missing daughter was alive. You think I don't remember the day I learned my daughter was gone? That isn't what I asked. Another pause. Then she said, Ruth really taught you to look at everything like a case file, didn't she? There it was. Not an answer. A change of subject. She taught me to check things before deciding what they mean. I am your mother, Audrey. You could ask me what it felt like instead of cross-examining me over dates. The old reflex came fast. Apologize. Tell her, I understood. Make the conversation soft again so she would stay. My mouth actually opened. Then my eyes dropped to the phone in my hand. 11 days. No, I said. I'm asking what happened. You have no idea what we went through. Then help me understand it. We already tried. The call ended 2 minutes later without a date. Back at my desk, I added another row to the chronology. I did not write Mom lied. I wrote, Denise states notification occurred, not for a long time. Exact interval not provided. Facts did not need my anger to make them heavier. Bethany agreed to meet me the following Saturday. She chose a diner halfway between us, the kind with laminate menus and coffee that appeared before you asked. Seeing her in person felt stranger than seeing my mother. Bethany had my eyes. Or maybe I had hers. That thought irritated me because neither version made sense. Yet it was the first thing I noticed. She slid into the booth across from me and gave an awkward smile. Okay, this is weird. Very. I almost brought Mom. My shoulders tensed. She told me not to. That surprised me. Bethany caught the expression on my face. She said we should have a chance to know each other without her sitting there. For the first 15 minutes, money never came up. Bethany asked what Ruth had been like, not how rich she was, not what she owned, what she was like. She made terrible meatloaf, I said. Bethany laughed. Really, truly terrible, dry enough to qualify as building material. What was she good at? Soup. Any soup. She could look at 6 things in a refrigerator and make something you wanted seconds of. Bethany smiled down at her coffee. I used to wonder what having an older sister would be like. The sentence landed somewhere I had not protected. What did you imagine? Mostly someone who would tell me when Mom was being unreasonable. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Bethany looked relieved. For a few minutes, she told me about college, the job she hated during her first summer after graduation, and how Dad still checked the oil in her car every time she visited. There was nothing monstrous about her. That made what came later harder. Mom used to cry every October, she said. My hand stopped beside my mug. October? Yeah, that month was always bad. Why October? Bethany looked puzzled. Because of you. I was left in the woods at the end of August. She frowned. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she shook her head. I don't know. October was when we always did the candle night. What candle night? For you. She described a small yearly gathering. Candles at church. A few relatives. Sometimes a post online about missing children. When did that start? I don't know. I was little. The answer was reasonable. Still. Another empty space appeared on my internal map. The date of a ritual had drifted away from the event it supposedly remembered. Maybe there was an innocent reason. Maybe October was simply when the church held an annual awareness service. I did not correct Bethany again. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Can I ask you something without you getting mad? You can ask. If you kept, like, $1 million and gave them the rest, would that really hurt you? There it was. The other Bethany. Not fake. Not evil. Just a young woman who had grown up inside a system where my resources had already been mentally distributed before anyone asked me. This isn't a math problem. I know, but 3.4 million is a lot of money. It is. They're not rich. I know. Mom says Ruth was able to give you everything because Mom and Dad lost the chance to. My being raised by Ruth was not a financial investment they made. That's not what I meant. It's where the argument goes. Bethany looked down. They just want something to make what happened feel less unfair. To them? Her eyes lifted. The question sat between us. For the first time, I saw uncertainty rather than defense. Then she said, to everybody. I paid for my own coffee. So did she. That tiny detail mattered to me more than it probably should have. Outside, Bethany hesitated beside her car. I really did want to meet you. I believe you. Even if I think you should help them? Yes. She nodded, but neither of us hugged. Trusting her would have been premature. Deciding she was my enemy would have been just as easy and just as dishonest. Caroline was harder to call. She had been the only Mercer who sent Ruth a Christmas card after my adoption was finalized. Nothing personal. Usually a printed family card with one handwritten line. Hope Audrey is well. Ruth kept every one. When Caroline answered, she sounded surprised. Audrey? Hi. My goodness. I wasn't expecting you. I need to ask you something about when I was 5. Her breathing changed. That was all. No confession. No dramatic pause. Just a small shift that made me sit straighter. Your mother was not herself back then, Caroline said. I didn't ask about her state of mind. No. I suppose you didn't. Did you know I'd been found? The line stayed quiet long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. Finally, Caroline said. I knew you were safe. My fingers tightened around the pen beside my notebook. When? Earlier than Denise likes to remember. My stomach turned. What does that mean? There was a meeting. What meeting? I don't remember what they called it. Something with the agency. Were you there? No. How did you know about it? Your mother called me afterward. What did she say? Caroline exhaled. That it had gone badly. What went badly? Audrey, I don't want to give you details I'm not certain about. For once, someone refusing to guess made me trust the answer more. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? Her voice lowered. There were consequences for getting in the middle of Denise's family. What consequences? That's a longer conversation. Caroline, I'm not hanging up on you. I'm telling you I need to think before I answer. That frustrated me, but it was still more honest than what Mom had given me. Before we ended the call, Caroline said one more thing. Whatever Denise tells you, don't let her convince you there was never a meeting. The first official records arrived just under 4 weeks after my request. Not everything. The agency email explained that the released batch contained accessible administrative records and that additional materials required further review and redaction. I downloaded the files to my personal computer. Then I made tea I never drank. The first pages duplicated what Ruth had saved. Notice. Case number. Acknowledgement. Dad's signature. That mattered because independent copies supported each other. Farther down came a contact log. The language was dry. Dates. Initials. Short entries. No one wrote that a little girl had sat beside a door wondering if her parents would come. Government records rarely contained the emotional version. They contained what someone did next. One entry stopped me. Both parents present for initial case planning meeting. I enlarged the line. Checked the date. Checked the page number. Then traced the reference to the next document in the release. There it was. An initial planning summary. My parents had attended. The agency had discussed temporary placement, assessment steps, and supervised contact. My hands moved away from the keyboard. For several minutes, the apartment filled with ordinary sounds. The refrigerator cycling. A car passing outside. Someone upstairs dragging a chair across the floor. Mom had told me the system had taken me and shut them out. Dad had said they had not known where I was. The records did not yet tell me why I never went home. But now there were 2 independent points I could establish. They were notified. They attended a meeting. I opened my chronology. Under Dad's claim, we never knew where you were. I changed the status. Contradicted by multiple sources. My finger hovered over Mom's contact information. For one reckless second, I wanted to send her everything. The notice. The acknowledgement. The meeting entry. I wanted to ask her how many dates I needed before she stopped calling dates an interrogation. Instead, I closed the message window. Not yet. A planning meeting did not tell me how reunification failed. A signed notice did not tell me who stopped trying. If I confronted them now, all I would accomplish was showing them exactly what I had. So I went back to the agency portal. My next request was narrower. Records related to supervised visits. Service plan documentation. Any accessible material showing scheduled contact, cancellations, assessments, or changes in reunification status. Then I asked what process existed for obtaining the portions of my own case history held elsewhere or subject to different access rules. The reply did not arrive that night. Mom did. Her text read, "Your father says we should talk again about the trust. This can all be handled privately." This time, there was no photograph attached. No baby in a yellow sleeper. No memory. Just money. I typed slowly. "If you want to discuss money, put it in writing." Her response came almost immediately. "Families don't need paper trails." For a moment, I stared at those words. Then I answered, "Then, we don't need to talk about money." I muted the thread. That was the first time in my life I had ended a conversation with my biological mother because I chose to, not because she disappeared from it. The next morning, I returned to the contact log. One entry near the bottom had been partially obscured by a redaction bar, so I had skipped over it the night before. Now I enlarged the readable portion. A date. A scheduled contact. Then 6 words. Next supervised visit. Cancelled by parent request. My pulse began beating against the base of my throat. The line did not say the agency cancelled. It did not say Ruth cancelled. It did not say whether, illness, or scheduling conflict. Parent request. I read it once, then again, then a third time. 20 years of my life had been built around one image, a car disappearing between the trees. Until that moment, I had thought the hardest question was why my parents had driven away. The record had just given me a worse one. Why, after someone gave them a chance to come back, had they canceled? The answer did not come from one canceled visit. That would have been easier. One canceled appointment could mean a sick child, a broken car, a work shift nobody could cover, or a mistake by someone typing into a case log 20 years ago. So I did what I would have done with any damaged collection at work. I looked for pattern before meaning. The next batch of record arrived 6 days later. By then, my chronology had grown wide enough that I had to scroll sideways to see all of it. Notification. Initial meeting. Assessment scheduled. Supervised visit scheduled. Parent cancellation. Another contact note. Another date. The language remained painfully ordinary. Parents unable to attend. Reschedule requested. 2 weeks later. No appearance for scheduled assessment. Follow-up attempted. Then, mother reports newborn care and transportation difficulties. Requests later date. Bethany. The date landed almost exactly where it should have. She had been a baby then. For several minutes, relief came so quickly that it embarrassed me. There. An explanation. Mom had a newborn. Dad was probably working. Money was tight. Transportation was difficult. Real problems. Human problems. Not monsters abandoning one daughter because they liked another one better. My fingers rested over the keyboard while that version of events assembled itself inside me with almost frightening speed. Then another thought followed. I had been their child while all of those problems were true. Being tired did not make me disappear. Being poor did not erase my name from the case plan. Having another baby did not turn a 5-year-old into someone else's responsibility by default. The records did not say my parents had no problems. They said those problems had become reasons not to show up. That distinction hurt more than anger would have. I kept reading. There were no dramatic sentences. No caseworker had written, "The Mercers do not love their daughter." Instead, there were dates. Missed appointments. Calls returned several days later. A home assessment moved twice. A supervised visit completed. Then another one canceled. One note said Dad had expressed frustration with what he called intrusive requirements. Another recorded that both parents believed my temporary placement was stable. Stable. The word sat there with the emotional temperature of a grocery receipt. Somewhere inside that word was a little girl who had learned not to ask when she was going home. A sound from the archive box made me look up. Not literally a sound. The cardboard had shifted because my elbow brushed it. Still, the movement drew my attention to the bundle of Ruth's letters. I had been avoiding them because documents written for agencies were one thing. Ruth's handwriting was another. Records told me what adults did. Her letters might tell me what I had looked like while they were doing it. The ribbon came loose with one pull. Most of the letters were addressed to Ruth's older sister in Idaho. Nothing official. Nothing intended to prove anything. One was dated a few months after I had entered her home. Ruth wrote about groceries first. Then a leaking faucet. Then me. Audrey has another visit tomorrow. She asked me 3 times whether the blue sweater makes her look good enough. I told her there is no sweater on earth responsible for whether a parent comes through a door. I'm not sure she believed me. The next paragraph blurred. I set the page down until the words stopped moving. When I picked it up again, Ruth had written. She sat by the front window from lunch until nearly 4. The visit was canceled. I did not know how to tell a 5-year-old that grown people can love you and still fail you in ways that feel exactly like not being loved. She asked if being good tomorrow would make them come next time. My chair scraped backward. The room suddenly smelled like pine. Not because there was pine anywhere near me. Memory did not ask permission before bringing its own weather. Stay right here. We'll be back. I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth. For years, I had thought the worst belief I carried from those woods was that my parents had abandoned me. It wasn't. The worst belief was the one that came after. If I behaved correctly enough, people would return. If I asked for less, they would stay. If I made myself useful, quiet, undemanding, there would be no reason to leave me again. That belief had survived the woods. It had survived foster care. It had survived adoption. It had even survived Ruth loving me well enough to prove it wrong. My phone buzzed across the table. For one irrational second, I expected Mom. It was a cousin I barely knew. Audrey, I don't want to get involved, but your mom is devastated. Whatever happened back then, your parents suffered too. Maybe money doesn't need to become another wound. Another message arrived before I finished reading. Then another. Different relatives. Same vocabulary. Punishment. Healing. Fairness. You have more than enough. By evening, 6 people had contacted me. None asked what the record said. Every one of them knew what I had inherited. I opened the longest message and started typing. I explained the notice, the signature, the meeting, the cancelled visits. Halfway through the second paragraph, my hands stopped. This was the old reflex, wearing a smarter coat. Explain until they understand. Provide enough context. Use the right tone. Make it impossible for anyone to misread me. As if accuracy could force fairness out of people who had already chosen their conclusion. The entire reply disappeared under my thumb. What I sent instead was 3 sentences. I am reviewing records from my own childhood. I will not discuss Ruth's estate through relatives. If Denise or Tom has a financial request, they can send it to me directly in writing. Then I copied the same response to the others. One cousin replied with a thumbs up. Another sent nothing. A third wrote, "That seems harsh." For once, harsh did not require an answer. The following afternoon, Bethany called. Her voice was tight from the first word. "Why are you doing this to Mom?" The question would have flattened me a month earlier. Now it made me look at the chronology open beside my laptop. Doing what? Dragging up all this stuff, calling Caroline, asking for records. Mom barely slept last night. How do you know that? She called me. Okay, that's all you have to say? What do you want me to say? I want you to understand what this is doing to people. My gaze landed on Ruth's letter. Blue sweater. Good enough. What did it do to you? I asked. Bethany went quiet. What? Growing up with all of this. What do you remember? I already told you. Tell me again. She let out a breath. Posters. Mom crying. The candle nights. Dad driving around looking. Everybody knowing there was this missing person in our lives. When did Dad drive around looking? I don't know, when I was little. How little? Why does that matter? Because you were about 1 when I disappeared. The line went still. Bethany said, I know how old I was. I'm not insulting you. It sounds like you are. No, I'm asking what you personally remember. I remember Mom crying. That I believe. And the candles. I believe that too. And the search. What part of the search? Her answer did not come. Seconds passed. A car horn sounded somewhere on her end of the call. Finally, she said, I don't know. My chest tightened. The point was not to win. Bethany, I'm not saying nothing happened. Then what are you saying? I'm saying some of what feels like memory might be what you were told. That's ridiculous. Maybe. You think Mom invented my childhood? No. The word came quickly because that was not what the evidence said. What I think is that you were very young, and everybody around you told the same story for years. That would shape what anybody remembers. Her breathing sharpened. You really have decided they're lying. No. I've decided I'm not going to call something true just because all of you learned the same version. She hung up. The blank screen reflected my face back at me. No victory. No satisfying click where Bethany suddenly saw everything. Just the unpleasant knowledge that I had said something she could not easily unhear. Caroline called me 2 nights later. I owe you an answer. I sat down on the edge of my couch. About what? Why I stayed out of it. The phrasing caught me. Not why she forgot. Why she stayed out. I'm listening. Her voice sounded smaller than it had during our first conversation. Denise and I had already been fighting before you disappeared. After you were found, I pushed her about the agency meetings. I told her she needed to do whatever they asked if that was what brought you home. What happened? She told me I had no idea what they were asking of them. Evaluations, home visits, scheduled appointments. She said people were treating them like criminals. I waited. Then, she told me if I kept siding with strangers over my own sister, I could stay away from Bethany too. My hand tightened around the edge of the cushion. She threatened to cut you off from Bethany. Yes. Did she? For almost a year, the answer was quiet. I did not know that. There would have been no way for me to know it, unless Caroline told me. When did you start seeing them again? After I apologized. For what? For getting involved. The words settled heavily between us. Caroline continued before I could respond. When Denise called after one of the meetings, she was furious. She said they wanted people coming through the house, checking things, setting times as if she and Tom had no life of their own. Bethany was tiny. Tom was working whenever he could. They were overwhelmed. Those facts matched the records closely enough to matter. What did you say? Caroline hesitated. I told her maybe she should stop fighting every requirement and just do them. A beat. Then I told her maybe it was all right to let things settle for a little while because you were safe. My eyes closed. There it was. Not a villain's plan. A sentence normal enough to say over the phone. A sentence that probably sounded compassionate. A sentence that made doing nothing easier. I helped make it sound reasonable, Caroline said. You knew there were visits? I knew there were supposed to be. You knew they had a way to see me? Yes. Why didn't you ever tell me? Her answer came without drama. Because every year made the first year harder to admit. That sentence hurt because I understood it. Understanding did not excuse it. You could have written Ruth. I know. You did write her. Christmas cards. You could have written more. I know. You could have told me when I turned 18. I know. Each time, Caroline accepted the sentence without defending herself. That made it impossible to hate her cleanly. It also made forgiveness feel unnecessary. Not yet. What exactly did Denise say after that meeting? I asked. I don't remember enough to quote her. Then don't. A small exhale came through the phone. She said they were being asked to prove they were fit to have their own daughter. Tom hated that. She kept saying you were doing well where you were, so nobody needed to rush. Did she say they wanted to stop trying? I don't remember those words. Okay. Audrey? Yes? I am sorry. My fingers loosened from the cushion. Thank you. That was all I gave her. An apology could be accepted without becoming a bridge. 3 days later, the next record's release arrived. The file contained a service summary, a planning document, more contact entries. I read them once for content, then again for chronology, then a third time for language. Several requirements were listed: home assessment, scheduled contact, participation in a parenting evaluation, follow-up with the assigned worker. None looked like an impossible legal labyrinth. They looked inconvenient. Intrusive, maybe. Humiliating if you believed nobody had the right to question you. But possible. The summary showed partial compliance. One appointment completed. Another missed. A rescheduled home visit. A second missed contact. Then, farther down, a sentence that made the rest of the page disappear. Parents state they do not wish to continue reunification services at this time and believe child is stable in current placement. At this time, 3 words people used when they wanted a decision to sound temporary. I checked the date, then the entry before it, then the one after. No mistake, no detached page, no duplicate from another file. My hands went numb. For weeks, part of me had still been searching for the moment where somebody else had taken the choice away from them. A judge, an agency, Ruth, money, a technicality, something. The record did not give me that. It gave me 2 adults saying they did not want to continue the process at that time because I was stable somewhere else. The room blurred around the screen. A memory came back, but not a useful one. No date. No adult dialogue. Just a blue sweater. That surprised me because I had forgotten owning one. A 5-year-old version of me smoothing the front of it with both hands. Trying to look good enough for someone who had canceled. Ruth's letter had given the image shape. The records gave it context. Suddenly, the woods were no longer the only abandonment that mattered. That had been one terrible decision. Afterward came smaller ones. Miss this appointment. Delay that visit. Reschedule. Wait. Let things settle. Do not continue services at this time. My parents had not lost me once. They had been given more than one chance to choose me after they knew I was alive. And more than once, they chose the life that did not require bringing me back. The realization did not make me feel powerful. It made me tired. Work the next morning was almost a relief. The scanner hummed. Metadata fields waited to be filled. Objects had edges. Dates stayed where you put them. Maya passed my desk around lunch and set down a sandwich. You forgot this in the break room. Thanks. She glanced at me. You okay? No. She nodded. No lecture. No demand for details. Want me to cover the intake meeting at 2? Normally I would have said yes out of embarrassment. Instead, I looked at the calendar. No, I can do it. The answer surprised me. For the first time in weeks, getting through something ordinary felt more important than spending every spare minute digging through my past. At 5, waiting had consumed the whole day. At 25, I had a job to return to. A rent payment already scheduled from money I earned myself. Groceries in my refrigerator. People who knew me without knowing my case number. By the end of the shift, another folder in the collection had been processed, 3 discrepancies documented, and 1 ordinary Tuesday had passed without my mother deciding what it meant. That mattered. Mom called just after 7 that evening. I almost let voicemail take it. Then I answered. Audrey. Her tone was controlled. Caroline told me you spoke. She did. You have been going around me to everyone. I asked Caroline about something she witnessed. She didn't witness anything. She loves drama. She knew there had been an agency meeting. Mom did not answer that. Instead, she said, You are tearing open a period of our lives that nearly destroyed us. No, I'm reading my own records. Records written by strangers. Some of them record your statements. Out of context. Then give me the context. You've already decided what you want to believe. That line almost worked. A month earlier, it would have sent me scrambling to prove neutrality. Now, the service summary sat beside me. I found the reunification plan. Nothing came through the phone for a second. Then Mom said, You don't understand those systems. I understand dates. Audrey, I understand that you were notified. I understand that you attended a planning meeting. I understand there were scheduled visits. You were doing well with Ruth. The sentence reached through 20 years and touched the exact wound the records had opened. My voice came out quieter. So you knew I was with her. That isn't what I said. Yes, it is. You're twisting my words. No, I'm listening to them. Her breathing became audible. You are letting paperwork turn you against your mother. There it was. The sentence I might once have apologized to prevent. No, I said. The paperwork is telling me what happened when I was too young to understand it. Ruth was not a saint. This isn't about Ruth. She benefited from keeping you. This isn't about Ruth. You have no idea what she... This is not about Ruth. The third time, Mom stopped. My pulse was fast, but my voice wasn't. I'm going to say this once. Do not discuss my inheritance with relatives. Do not send people to pressure me. If you or Dad wants to communicate about money, do it directly and in writing. You don't get to dictate how this family speaks. I get to dictate how people contact me. You're making yourself alone. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. For a second, the forest returned. Dark road. No headlights. 5 years old. Alone meant danger then. Alone meant nobody was coming. At 25, alone could also mean my own apartment, my own keys, and a conversation I was free to end. If those are the terms, I said, then I can live with them. Mom hung up first. My hands shook afterward. Boundaries did not feel victorious. They felt like doing something terrifying without the guarantee anyone would respect it. I made tea, ate half a piece of toast, then forced myself to close the records for the night. At 10:17, my phone began vibrating across the coffee table. One message, then another, then 4 more. Cousins, an aunt, a former neighbor whose name I barely recognized. My email notification appeared next. The sender was Denise Mercer. The recipient line contained nearly 20 addresses. The subject read, The truth about what happened to Audrey. For several seconds, I only stared. Then I opened it. Mom had written paragraphs about grief, poverty, Ruth, a system that had taken advantage of vulnerable young parents, and a daughter now being influenced by money. I did not read all of it. I stopped at the second paragraph. We weren't even told Audrey had been found until years later. My gaze moved from the screen to the archival sleeve beside my laptop. Inside it sat the acknowledgement notice. My father's signature at the bottom, dated 11 days after I was found. For weeks, I had been afraid the records would force me to choose between truth and the possibility of having my biological family back. Mom had just made the choice simpler. She had put the lie in writing. The email stayed open on my screen until nearly midnight. We weren't even told Audrey had been found until years later. That sentence bothered me more than the paragraphs around it. The rest was opinion. Mom had written that Ruth had more money, better connections, and the advantage of a system that treated young parents like suspects. She said grief had divided people who should have been helping one another. She described me as someone reopening wounds that had never healed. Those were arguments. I could disagree with them, but I could not place them beside a date and prove them false. The first sentence was different. It was a claim. Claims could be checked. By 1 a.m, my dining table held the acknowledgement notice, the planning entry, the visitation record, the service summary, and a legal pad covered in arrows I later crossed out because they made the page look more certain than the evidence deserved. I started over. 4 columns. Claim. Record. Date. Source. No adjectives. No line labeled lie. No column for what I believed my mother wanted. The first row was simple. Claim. We weren't told Audrey had been found until years later. Record. Agency notice confirming I had been located alive. Acknowledgement signed by Thomas Mercer. Date. 11 days after I was found. Source. Agency record and copy preserved by Ruth. The second row took longer. Claim. We never had a chance to bring her home. Against it went the initial case planning entry, the supervised visitation schedule, and the service plan. The third concerned Ruth. Mom had repeatedly said Ruth kept me from them. The records I possessed did not prove Ruth had never made mistakes. They did not prove she had been easy to work with. They did not give me a complete moral biography of anyone involved. What they did show was that my parents had been offered steps they could take themselves. That was what went into the packet. The fourth claim was the one I left partially unresolved. We searched for 20 years. I had no interest in proving where they had driven, what posters they had printed, or how often Mom had cried at church. They might genuinely have spent later years searching after earlier opportunities had closed. So beneath that claim, I wrote, current records establish earlier contact and participation. Later search activity not independently evaluated. Reading that sentence gave me an unexpected sense of relief. I did not have to make them worse than they were in order to stop protecting them from what they had done. By morning, the packet was 6 pages long, not the hundreds of pages in my private files. 6. Enough to answer the statements Mom had put in front of other people. Not enough to turn my childhood into public property. Maya found me staring at the printer in our department break area just after 9. You look like you're waiting for it to confess something, she said. It already printed what I asked for. That sounds disappointing. A laugh escaped before I could stop it. She glanced at the folder under my arm, but did not ask to see it. Are you sending all of that to your relatives? No. Good. I looked at her. You don't even know what's in it. I know you. That is a dangerously sentimental answer. It's 9 a.m. I'm a loud one. Back at my workstation. Another email waited. This one had nothing to do with the Mercers. My preservation fellowship proposal had passed the department's internal review, and I had been asked to give a short presentation that Friday before it could move to the next stage. For almost a minute, my first thought was to decline. Friday was also when Dad had suggested everyone meet. There were records to organize, questions to prepare. Mom's email had already generated 3 more messages from relatives. The idea of standing in a conference room discussing access standards for regional archives while my biological parents tried to rewrite 20 years of my life felt almost absurd. Then I caught myself opening the calendar to rearrange my presentation. That old instinct again. Move everything. Make room. Someone might leave if I do not. I closed the calendar. The presentation stayed where it was. For 20 years, I had rearranged myself around people who might disappear. I was not going to rearrange my entire life around people who already had. Friday morning, I spent 12 minutes explaining why small community collections needed preservation systems they could maintain without expensive proprietary platforms. Nobody in the room knew what was happening with my parents. Nobody needed to. For those 12 minutes, I was not an abandoned daughter with $3.4 million somebody else wanted. I was Audrey Hale. I knew the material. I answered the questions. Afterward, Maya met me in the hallway. You were good. I talked too fast. You always talk too fast when you care. That doesn't sound like good feedback. It's free feedback. My phone vibrated before I could answer. Bethany. The message contained only 5 words. Do you actually have proof? I read it twice. Then I called her. She answered quickly. Mom's email, Bethany said. You're saying that part isn't true? I'm saying I have records that contradict it. What records? A notice sent after I was found. How soon? 11 days. Nothing came through the line. Then Bethany asked, Does it have their names? Yes. Send it to me. My hand stopped over the folder. The complete case file included information about me that Bethany had no automatic right to see. Notes about placement. Things I had said as a child. Ruth's address. Evaluations. This was exactly how private information started spreading, one emotional moment at a time. I'll send you the notice and acknowledgement, I said. Why not everything? Because everything is still my childhood record. I'm your sister. That doesn't make every page yours. Her breath came out sharply, but she did not argue. I scanned the 2 pages into a separate PDF, checked that nothing unrelated was included, and sent them. The call remained connected. For a while, all I heard was movement on her end. Then she said, That's Dad's signature. Yes. He told me they didn't know you'd been found until you were almost 8. My spine straightened. He told you that, specifically? Yes. When? I don't know. Growing up. More than once. Okay. That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Neither did I. Bethany's voice dropped. Are you trying to make me pick a side? No. Because that's what this feels like. I'm not asking you to choose me. Then what are you asking? Nothing. The word seemed to confuse her. Nothing. Read the document. Ask whatever questions you want. Believe whatever survives the answers. She did not speak for several seconds. Then she ended the call. That afternoon, 3 screenshots arrived. They were from Bethany's own conversation with Mom. The first question Bethany had sent was visible at the top. Dad signed this 11 days after Audrey was found. Why did you tell us you didn't know? Mom's answer. That notice did not mean they told us where she was. It only meant someone said she had been located. Bethany had replied. But you knew she was alive. Mom. We knew the system said she was safe. We did not know where she was. The next screenshot came 23 minutes later. Bethany had apparently asked about the case planning meeting. Mom's response had changed. Of course, we eventually knew the placement. That was when we started trying to get her back. Ruth made everything impossible. I laid my phone beside the packet. 3 versions. We were not told she had been found. We knew she was safe, but not where she was. We knew the placement, but Ruth prevented reunification. Each sentence might have been spoken on a different day and survived. Placed beside one another, they could not all carry the same story. Mom had not become less emotional. She had become more specific. That was the mistake. Specific statements left edges. Edges could be compared. I saved the screenshots exactly as Bethany had sent them, including the timestamps, and noted where they had come from. Nothing more. No triumphant message. No request that she keep questioning Mom. Around 7, Bethany called again. There's a box in the attic, she said without greeting me. What box? Old papers, missing posters, newspaper stuff. I saw it when I was looking for Christmas decorations last year. My body went alert. Okay, I can get it. No, she stopped. What? Don't take anything for me. What if there's proof in there? Then ask them to show it to you. They'll say no. That's their answer. You've been looking for proof this whole time. I've been requesting records I have a right to access and using things Ruth legally kept. So I'm not asking you to steal from Mom and Dad. It's not stealing. I live there. Whose box is it? A pause. Theirs. Then don't take it. Frustration sharpened her voice. What am I supposed to do if they lied to me? The question hit harder than I expected. A month earlier, I would have known exactly what to tell her. Come it to me. Believe me. Help me prove it. That would have felt like justice. It also would have turned Bethany into the same thing. Mom had made her a person whose loyalty mattered more than her right to think for herself. That's yours to decide, I said. That's not helpful. It's the most honest answer I have. You could tell me what you think. I think the records contradict things we were told. I think you deserve to ask about that. I'm not going to tell you what relationship you're allowed to have with them afterward. Bethany gave a humorless little laugh. You're better at this than Mom. At what? Making something sound reasonable when it hurts. That stung. Maybe because part of it was fair. I'm sorry it hurts. Are you sorry you showed me? No. She ended the call soon after. The following evening, Dad called alone. At least, I thought he was alone. I could not hear Mom in the background. His voice had lost the force he used at the coffee shop. Denise wants everybody in one room. What do you want? A small pause. I want this to stop getting bigger. That's different. Different from what? Wanting the truth. He sighed. There's no point turning every form from 20 years ago into some kind of trial. You called before and said forms didn't show what it was like. They don't. Then you tell me what they're missing. He did not answer. The quiet reminded me of our earlier call, when he had nearly said they knew I was safe before correcting himself. Finally, Dad said, pick somewhere neutral. That mattered. Not because it was an apology. It wasn't. It sounded more like a man who no longer trusted what might happen if the conversation took place on his own ground. I'll choose the place, I said. Fine. No documents for me to sign. We're just talking. No trust papers. No settlement. No transfer. Fine. And if anyone starts yelling or hitting furniture, I leave. His answer came after a beat. Fine. Caroline agreed to come when I called. I'm not asking you to defend me, I told her. I know. If you remember something, say only what you remember. I understand. And if you don't know, say you don't know. I can do that. That was all I needed from her. The restaurant had a small private room near the back. Neutral enough. Public enough that nobody could pretend the evening was something other than a conversation. Mom arrived first with Bethany. Bethany gave me a brief nod but took the chair farthest from both of us. Caroline came next. Dad entered last. For the first several minutes, nobody mentioned the woods. Mom began with the email. I sent that because you were letting everyone believe we just threw you away and forgot you. I didn't send anyone anything before your email. You talked to Caroline. Yes. You talked to Bethany. She called me. Mom looked toward my sister. Bethany's eyes stayed on the water glass in front of her. Dad pulled out his chair. We can go in circles for another month, or we can solve this. How? He looked at me. You put the estate where it belongs. Something inside me settled. Not anger. Recognition. After every photograph, every story about searching, every warning about legal challenges, and every accusation that I was tearing people apart, we had returned to the same place. Money. That money belongs to us, Dad said. His palm came down against the table. The water in my glass jumped. So did something old inside my body. For half a second, 5 years disappeared. A slammed car door. An engine. The certainty that adults controlled whether I stayed or went. Then the present returned. A restaurant chair under my legs. My purse beside my foot. My own car outside. A door less than 20 feet away. I looked directly at him. If you hit the table again, I leave. Dad stared back. His hand remained where it was. Then he moved it into his lap. No second impact came. I opened my folder. You said Ruth took advantage of a temporary placement. Mom immediately leaned forward. She did. You said the system kept you from knowing where I was. It did. Dad's jaw tightened. I removed the first page and slid it across the table. Is that your signature? He looked down. The change in his face was exactly as I remembered it from the beginning of this story. The color drained along his cheeks. Mom reached toward the page. That isn't what you think it is. I haven't told you what I think. Her hand stopped. I'm asking whether that's his signature. Nobody spoke. Dad? His mouth tightened. Yes. The word was barely louder than the air conditioner. 11 days after I was found? He looked at the date. Yes. Mom jumped in. That only proves they notified us you were alive. It doesn't prove they let us have you back. I agree. The answer slowed her. I placed the next page beside the first. This shows both of you attended the initial case planning meeting. Mom's expression hardened. We attended meetings. I never said we didn't. Bethany looked up. You did. Mom turned toward her. I said we didn't know what was happening for years. You wrote that you weren't told she'd been found. That is not the same thing. Bethany opened her mouth, then closed it. I moved to the third document. Scheduled supervised contact. Mom glanced at it. We were treated like criminals. Cancelled by parent request. You have no idea what our lives looked like. I don't. The answer came easily now. That's why I'm not telling you how you felt. Another page. Missed assessment. Dad shifted. I was working. I believe you. Then why are you doing this? Because being busy and being prevented are not the same thing. Mom's chair moved slightly. We had Bethany. She was a baby. We had bills. We had strangers wanting to inspect our home and judge every decision we made. You were safe. Bethany's head lifted. The room changed. Not dramatically. No gasp. No cinematic silence. Just a sentence that could not be put back where it came from. You were safe. Mom had moved again. From not knowing I had been found, to knowing I was alive, to knowing my placement, and now to knowing I was safe enough that bringing me home could wait. Mom looked at Bethany. You were an infant. We were barely surviving. I was trying to protect both my children. Dad rubbed one hand across his mouth. Then he said, Denise, stop. She turned toward him. What? That's not what we said back then. Nobody moved. Mom's voice became very measured. What exactly are you trying to say? Dad looked at the documents. Not at me. I'm saying we didn't talk about it like that. Like what? Like we were protecting Audrey by leaving her there. Mom's face tightened. You know what it was like. I do. Then don't sit there and let her reduce it to paperwork. I'm not. Dad finally looked at me. Something defensive remained in his face. This was not repentance. It was not rescue. It looked much closer to a man realizing the version he was being asked to repeat had moved too far from the one he remembered. Mom turned back toward me. This is exactly what Ruth wanted. She wanted you to believe we chose her over you. This isn't about Ruth. It is always about Ruth. No. My voice stayed level. It's about what you did after you knew I was alive. Mom pushed back from the table. We tried. How long? We tried. How long? You want dates for everything. Yes. Because that's how you can make us look bad. No. Dates are how I know which story happened first. Bethany spoke before Mom could answer. What did you tell them? Mom turned toward her. What? When they asked you to keep trying. The question came quietly. Bethany's hands were flat against the table now. You keep saying it was impossible. Audrey says there was a plan. Dad says you didn't talk about leaving her there like it was for her own good. Mom looked toward Caroline. Caroline did not rescue her. She only said, there was a plan. Mom's mouth tightened. Bethany asked again. What did you tell them? No answer came. The last page was still inside my folder. For weeks, I had thought of it as the worst one. The sentence that had taken the forest out of my childhood and stretched it across months of adult choices. I removed it. Dad saw the page and looked away first. Mom did not. I placed the case summary in the center of the table. Not in front of her. In front of Bethany. Her eyes moved down the page. I watched until they stopped at the line I already knew by memory. Parents elect not to continue reunification services at this time. Beneath it came the phrase that had followed me since I first read it. Child stable in current placement. Bethany's fingers touched the edge of the paper. Then she looked at our mother. What did you tell them when they asked you to keep trying? Mom opened her mouth. For the first time since she came back into my life, no version arrived quickly enough. Mom's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time since she had returned to my life, the room was not waiting for me to explain myself. It was waiting for her. Bethany kept one hand on the case summary. What did you tell them? Mom looked from her to Dad, then to Caroline, and finally back to me. We told them we needed time. Bethany's expression barely changed. How much time? We had a newborn. Your father was working constantly. People were coming into our home, asking questions, judging everything. We were drowning. Dad stared at the table. Mom kept going. Audrey was safe. She was cared for. Ruth had stability we didn't have. There it was again. Safe. Stable. Words that sounded responsible when nobody asked what they cost the child being described. Bethany looked down at the document. So you knew where she was? We knew she was being cared for. That's not what you told me. Bethany, you were a baby. You don't understand what that time was like. No, Bethany said. Apparently I don't. Mom turned toward me. You see what you're doing? The old accusation almost found its place inside me. Almost. For most of my life, any conflict involving me had been evidence that I had caused the conflict. Ruth used to tell me there was a difference between starting a fire and turning on the light. I had never understood how often I confused the two. Bethany asked you a question, I said. You brought her into this. She brought herself. You sent her documents. She asked to see them. Mom's face tightened. And you couldn't wait to turn my daughter against me. My daughter. The words were so ordinary that they might have passed without notice. They didn't. Bethany noticed too. Her eyes lifted. I looked at Mom. Which daughter? Nobody moved. Mom's expression changed. Only slightly. But enough. That is not what I meant. I know. For once, I did. She meant the daughter she had raised. The daughter whose childhood had taken place under her roof. The daughter who had been present for birthdays, graduations, fights, holidays, illnesses, and ordinary Tuesdays. Bethany was real to her in a way I had not been for 20 years. That truth hurt, but it no longer surprised me. Mom leaned back. You wanted an explanation. I'm giving you one. No, you're giving me reasons. What's the difference? Reasons explain why you made a choice. My hand rested beside the last document. They don't erase that it was a choice. Her face went still. The sentence did not feel clever when I said it. It felt overdue. Dad finally spoke. We made mistakes. I turned toward him. He had not said we were prevented. Not Ruth stole you. Not the system shut us out. Mistakes. A smaller word than what happened, but closer to reality than anything he had given me before. Mom looked at him sharply. Tom. What? You're making it sound like we just walked away. Dad gave a tired laugh with no humor in it. What do you want me to call it? Something in the room shifted again. Not enough to make him my ally. Not enough to absolve him. He had signed the notice. Missed appointments. Allowed the same story to survive for years. Then, demanded Ruth's estate. As if money could restore authority, he had surrendered himself. But the two of them were no longer speaking from one script. That mattered. Mom must have felt the change because she went back to the one subject that had brought them to me in the first place. Whatever happened then, Ruth's estate could fix some of this now. For a second, I thought I had misheard. Dad closed his eyes. Bethany looked at Mom. Caroline stared down at her folded hands. Mom continued, You have more money than you could reasonably need at your age. Your father and I lost years with you. Bethany grew up without her sister. There is a house that needs work. Your father's retirement is not where it should be. We spent years dealing with what happened. Every sentence made the next one easier to hear. This was not about legality. It was not even really about Ruth. Money had become a way to make the past produce compensation for the people who had made the decisions. No, I said. Mom blinked. Audrey, listen. No. Dad's hand moved against his knee. You're not even willing to discuss an amount? No. A reasonable amount? No. Mom stared at me. You have millions, and none of it belongs to you. Her voice sharpened. After everything we lost? The answer came before fear could edit it. You don't get reimbursed for not raising me. Bethany looked away. Dad pushed back from the table. That's a disgusting way to put it. It's the way you put it when you demanded the estate. I said that money exists because Ruth got to live the life we should have had. No. Ruth's estate exists because she worked, invested, saved, and planned for decades. She got you. The sentence left Dad's mouth hard. like that, explained everything. I looked at him. I wasn't a prize she won. His face changed. That landed. Good. Not because I wanted him hurt. Because I was tired of hearing adults describe my childhood as a contest between people who claimed ownership over me. Mom's voice dropped. We were your parents. You were. Her eyes narrowed. Were? You were my parents when you received that notice. You were my parents when you canceled visits. You were my parents when you decided not to continue reunification services. The table seemed too small for the words. That's why it matters. Mom's breathing became uneven. Then she said the sentence I had been expecting without knowing I was expecting it. I'm still your mother. The reaction inside me was immediate. 5 years old. Wait here. Be good. Do not move. Do not make this harder. The ache that came with that word had survived adoption, adulthood, therapy, grief, and every ordinary proof Ruth gave me that love could stay. Mom. Some part of me still wanted it. Not Denise, exactly. The position. The word. The promise of being someone's daughter without having to earn it. That was the last thing she still had. Not money. Not facts. Access to that wanting. My eyes dropped to the water glass. The surface had gone still after Dad hit the table. So had my hands. Yes, I said. Mom's face softened immediately. You are. She leaned toward me. That's why I spent 20 years waiting for you to choose me. Her expression froze. I'm done waiting. The words left a strange quiet behind them. Mom shook her head. You think you can just cut us off because you found some papers? No. Then what are you saying? I'm saying the papers answered the question I kept using to excuse everything else. What question? Whether you had a choice. She looked away. That was answer enough. I closed the folder. Mom's chair scraped. If you walk out now, don't blame me when this family closes the door. The sentence should have terrified me. Maybe it did. A little. But a door was not the same thing at 25 as it had been at 5. At 5, a closed door meant adults controlled whether I was inside. At 25, I had my own apartment key in my purse. My own paycheck. My own work waiting Monday morning. My own name on my own documents. That door has never been the same thing as family, I said. Then I stood. Nobody stopped me. Bethany did not follow. That hurt more than I expected. I made it through the restaurant, across the parking lot, and into my car before my hands started shaking. For a few minutes, I did nothing. No victory speech. No triumphant music. Just breathing. The strange thing about finally choosing yourself is that your body does not always know it was the right decision. Mine felt like I had just done the exact thing I had spent 20 years trying not to do. Leave before someone chose to leave me. The difference was that this time, I knew where I was going. Home. A week passed before Bethany contacted me. Not Mom. Not Dad. Bethany. Her message arrived while I was reheating soup after work. I'm staying with a friend for a while. I read it once. Then again. No explanation. No accusation. A second message appeared. I don't know what I believe yet. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. The old version of me would have rushed in. Sent documents. Explained dates. Told her exactly what I thought she should believe. Instead, I wrote, You don't owe me an answer. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then returned. Neither did you. That was all. She did not call me her sister. I did not invite her over. Nothing had been repaired. But for the first time, we had spoken without Mom standing between us, even when she was nowhere physically near the conversation. That felt like the beginning of something, or maybe only the end of something else. Either way, I let it be small. Caroline called 2 days later. Denise asked me to talk to you. My stomach tightened. And? I told her no. The tension eased slightly. Caroline continued. I'm not doing that anymore. Thank you. She says you've humiliated her. I didn't send the records to anyone until she emailed them first. I know. Did you tell her that? Yes. A pause. She didn't like hearing it. That was not my problem. The realization arrived almost casually. It was startling how many things became simple when I stopped treating another person's discomfort as an emergency. Caroline told me a few relatives had contacted her asking what really happened. She had told them only what she personally remembered. There had been agency meetings. Denise had known I was safe. Caroline had advised her to comply with the requirements, then later helped make delay sound reasonable. Nothing more. No invented motives. No dramatic retelling. Some of them still think you should forgive them, she said. They can think that. Some think you should give them money. They can think that too. Caroline laughed quietly. You sound like Ruth. The comparison caught me off guard. Maybe. No. You do. For once, it did not feel like being asked to choose which mother counted. It simply felt like being told someone had left fingerprints on the way I moved through the world. That was allowed. The first message from Mom after the dinner came 3 days later. It was long enough that I had to scroll. I read only once. She said I had misunderstood their decisions. That she and Dad had been young. That money and fear had shaped what they could do. That Ruth had been given opportunities they had not. That Bethany was now emotionally confused. Then came the last paragraph. When you are ready to hear my side without attacking me, I will be here. There was no apology. More importantly, there was no question. Not how I was doing. Not whether reading the records had hurt. Not what I remembered. Not what I needed. Only an invitation to return when I was prepared to listen correctly. For most of my life, that invitation would have worked. I would have thought the door was still open. Now I could see the condition attached to the handle. I archived the message. Did not block her. Did not answer. Dad sent one shorter text later that week. I'm not asking for the money again. I wish things had happened differently. That was closer to responsibility than anything Mom had sent. Still not enough to restart a relationship, so I did not treat it as one. I wish they had too, I replied. Nothing else. Over the next month, something unexpected happened. My life became boring again. Wonderfully boring. A preservation project went behind schedule because a donor had mislabeled 6 boxes. The fellowship proposal I had presented before the dinner was approved for development. Maya and I spent an entire lunch arguing about whether an office plant could be declared dead if one leaf was still green. Groceries needed buying. Laundry accumulated. My car needed an oil change. For weeks, investigating my childhood had made every ordinary task feel temporary. As if real life could not resume until I solved the past. Eventually, I understood that was another form of waiting. So the case records went into a locked cabinet at home. The source packet remained backed up in 2 places. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was displayed. Evidence did not need to remain open on my dining table in order to stay true. The estate settled fully a few months later. I kept my job. That confused several relatives who apparently imagined $3.4 million should immediately transform me into someone who bought a luxury house and never answered another email. Instead, I met with ordinary financial professionals, set aside appropriate reserves, and put most of the money into long-term diversified management. Ruth had spent decades building stability. Turning it into a revenge performance would have made no sense. One small portion went somewhere else. The library had been trying to fund a modest fellowship for early career preservation work in community collections. The idea had existed before Ruth died. My proposal had nothing to do with my biological parents. Once the program cleared the proper review, I contributed enough to help establish it and asked that Ruth's name be attached quietly. No giant plaque, no gala, just the Ruth Hale Preservation Fellowship. Maya read the final draft on my screen. She would hate that you spent money on a nameplate. She absolutely would. So why do it? Because she isn't here to stop me. Maya laughed. That afternoon, I went home and opened Ruth's letterbox again. Not the agency records. The letters. There were dozens I still had not digitized. This time, they did not feel like evidence. They were simply part of my life. One letter described my first school play. Another complained about the price of furnace repair. One included a recipe Ruth insisted she had improved, though I recognized it immediately as the terrible meatloaf. I set up my small scanner and began working. Capture. Check. Name. Store. Ordinary steps. Outside my window, rain tapped against the glass. My phone lit once. I ignored it until the current page was finished. When I finally checked, the message was from Mom. When you're ready to hear my side, I'll be here. Almost the same words as before. For several seconds, My thumb rested above the screen. Then I archived it. No speech. No punishment. No final attempt to make her understand that I already had heard her side. More than once, the phone went dark. On my laptop, 2 old folders sat next to the new scans. I had created them during the first weeks of the record search. What they told me. What I know. For months, that distinction had kept me steady. Now it felt incomplete. The first folder could stay. It was history. The second one was mine to rename. The cursor blinked in the text field. I deleted the words, typed 2 new ones. My life. The screen blurred for a second. Not from grief exactly. Something softer. 20 years earlier, my entire world had been defined by waiting beside a tree for the people who told me they were coming back. Now nobody was coming to save the evening. Nobody needed to. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A stack of Ruth's letters waited beside the scanner. Work started at 8 the next morning. There was soup in the refrigerator. My keys were on the counter. The ordinary details felt almost luxurious. Another notification appeared. Bethany. For a second, my body reacted with the same old urgency. Answer quickly. Do not make her wait. Do not risk losing the chance. Then I stopped, finished scanning the letter in front of me, entered the file name, checked the copy, put the original back in its sleeve. Only then did I pick up my phone. Bethany had written, "Can I ask you something about Ruth sometime?" Nothing about Mom. Nothing about money. Nothing about choosing sides. Just Ruth. The woman who raised the sister Bethany had never been allowed to know outside somebody else's story. I did not answer immediately. Not because I wanted to punish her, because I was learning that love did not require panic. Finished my coffee. Closed the scanner lid. Looked once at the folder labeled, "My Life." Then when I was ready, I typed, "Yes, you can ask."